Camilla. We'll be hearing from you shortly. So people are lined up and ready to go. And if you had enough, several warnings now, Marla, now you're up, as they say.
Thank you so much, Professor Dan. Let me share my screen. I'm very glad to be able to present today. So unfortunately, it's an early morning here in Indiana, so I couldn't be able to attend the previous presentations, but I'm looking forward for the following ones. So thank you for the organizers and to SOAS and Maynooth University for this. And I'm just delighted to join these incredible scholars, like after reading the biographies. So just as mentioned, as the Professor Dan has mentioned, I am currently finalizing my MA in International Studies and Diplomacy at SOAS, and I'm also currently a Fulbright candidate for the Masters of Global Affairs here at Notre Dame in Indiana. Before joining SOAS, I was the National Junior Professional at the Special Tribunal for Lebanon in the Outreach and Legacy Unit. So this is my background, and I just wanted to start by showing this image capturing a dragon boat. I know it sounds remarkable, but I would love to hear some thoughts from you. Why do you think I'm showing this image in a presentation talking about the UNWCC justice and war crimes? So just feel free to share in the screen or like to unmute yourself. Okay, yeah, Omar, go ahead.
Go on.
Hello, I think you're sharing this image as it shows a linear boat, as it's showing that we are all in this together, which reflects to the international law, as if we go to one direction or the other, depending on how the committee votes or decide, it can affect us all and our destiny.
Thank you so much. That's very deep. Thank you so much, Omar, for sharing. Since I'm sharing, I'm not able to follow the chat. So Professor Dan, if people are just like popping up in the chat, would you mind, please?
I will try.
Okay.
With you sharing screen, I only have a
I can just stop sharing for a second and see if, okay.
Mm-hmm.
I can let you know, Marla, if anything pops up.
Yeah,
Oh,
okay.
thanks.
Okay, let me go back and share my screen.
Yep.
Okay, so actually my personal reflection out of this dragon boat is like to challenge the mindset of the linear way of thinking, how to collectively move away from the linear way of thinking, of solving problems, and how to understand the international legal system that we live in. So this is the core insight in writing my paper, which is actually trying to understand a past system and also helping understand why our international legal system has been operating in this way for a long time. What does the history of the UNWCC offer to us today? What approaches can we choose to apply them, but also in what political and legal context they would best operate? So I hope at the end of this presentation to provide you with some insights and maybe answers to these questions. The aim of this paper is to assess the relevance of the UNWCC in today's local and international jurisdictions. And in order to assess this relevance, I based my research question on how the work of the UNWCC can be connected to today's practice of international law towards the near establishment of a new legal paradigm which supports domestic jurisdictions. So this question holds two major assumptions. The first one is actually the connection part, and the second one is this creation of a new legal paradigm or mechanism in support to national courts. As a pragmatic researcher, I would love to start by some unhopeful findings. Let's put it in this way. So first, the UNWCC is remote. More than 70 years have passed since the creation of the UNWCC, and any legal foundation becomes obviously less and less relevant as the years go by. lawyers, judges, prosecutors will be looking more at modern precedents, not going back, and that's where the gap comes in. The UNWCC was successful. Why? Mainly because of two reasons. The first one is that the UNWCC members were simply not ready for international court. And so that's why the UNWCC members were mainly focusing on national jurisdictions. The second reason is because there was a common enemy, the German Nazis. That's why the UNWCC came into existence, because of this common enemy. Therefore, it worked out because it was establishing or operating during a particular period in the history. Also, there is no appetite today to have another body setting up aside of the ICC. So with the ICC and the ad hoc tribunals, it's very unlikely to have this room for a new legal body where countries come together like the UNWCC. So to sum up, the UNWCC was peculiar to World War II in this particular time in the history. However, what's missing in this picture? So back to the dragon boat and back to like how to collectively unpack systems. Here are like some important points to mention. The first one is that the world has changed, and now we are very good in establishing new tribunals and international courts, mainly because of more available resources. However, there is no real exploitation or consumption to one particular court before closing or moving to a second one. So a very great example of this would be the Special Tribunal for Lebanon and the experience of justice by citizens. Is it always necessary to constantly establish international court? I want to also mention this idea of integrate complementarity. I've engaged in reading wide literature on like this primary versus complementary jurisdiction, and also does complementarity means only unable and unwilling. And so in the sense that the ICC is based on the principle of complementarity, but we all know, even with the existence of the ICC, that the future of the ICC is not based at the level of the tribunals, but rather at the national level. And a great example would be a recent example, actually, Sudan giving up last August al-Bashir to the ICC. So it's here very important to know to question what's the role of the international institutions in helping states, like to hand over this top high level people the states will never be willing to hand over. So what was the role? What were the incentives of this fact? And what is the role of the international institutions in this? So by analyzing these patterns, I came to conclude that there will always be a missing link between international courts' mandate and delivering the needed support for national courts. So we need to try a new approach in dealing with international crimes, as the ICC alone and the ad hoc tribunals cannot attain a comprehensive justice. So here it comes how we can learn from the UNWCC. Operated as a non-legal body is the main UNWCC approach that is much needed in today's international justice. How to do so, or what is the proposed way to learn, the proposed lesson to learn from the ICC is basically creating a group of like-minded countries or scholars, establishing some sort of mechanism that investigates or help in the investigations in what happened in a particular state. And it might be a large scale, one of the 4 international crimes, but also it might be one single event considered a massive crimes against humanity. How could this happen without the political context of World War II? Simply because we still have the same fears and we still have the same needs. And in terms of the challenges, we kind of have this like political significance, but coming from both sides. Would the states be willing to cooperate with this? And most of the time, or all, not to say all of the time, will not be willing. And how to ensure, how to make use of the multilateralism in order like to force country to cooperate in investigating a particular crime. And also from the other side is the ICC. How will the ICC be willing to cooperate with a illegal non-court body? In terms of feasibility, I just briefly want to mention a case study, which is the Beirut blast that happened last August in 2020, and see how this approach could be implemented successfully in this case. So in August 2020, a huge amount of nitrate ammonium have been exploded in pour Beirut, the capital of Lebanon. It led to a detrimental destruction of the city and its residents. In terms of the scale of the event, I don't want to engage whether this event, like this crime, could be considered a crime against humanity or not, simply because we still don't know what happened. Is it because of it is because made of like by foreign power, or because as the government said, it's like a result of a fire breaking out? Whatever the result would be, because now we are still in the investigations, the only thing we know is that the consequences force us to seek justice. But what we have now, Lebanon is unable and unwilling. We have civil unrest, political instability, security, and even random armed tensions every time Tariq Bitar, the judge who's leading the investigation, declares a new accused top-level politician or member of parliament to be accused or defendant. So within this battle for accountability, what is the solution? We have a complete lack of faith in the national jurisdiction, and at the same time, an inability to go for an international court, a new international tribunal. So with the help of international dollars, group of like-minded countries like the UNWCC approach, we can establish this sort of mechanism that can investigate, but most importantly, this should gain the trust of the public. So to sum up, if within a criminal regime, like in Lebanon, the UNWCC approach seems to be feasible, so there are strong and solid reasons today to reinforce the efforts and consider examining and drafting a practical framework like the UNWCC approach to be implemented. And we can't know until we try. And thank you for listening.
Well, Marla, that's an astonishing, effective presentation in both recognizing the very different, hugely different political circumstances that enable the creation of UNWCC, but still extracting from that powerful elements that you then apply to one of the most disastrous and unattributable occurrences at the heart of the Middle East, one of the world's most troubled regions, as we all know so well. So congratulations on scanning the centuries and extracting lessons and looking to apply them. Thank you so much.
I just want to add one thing, because I think I missed it, is this idea of like, in my paper, I followed a qualitative research methods, and I aim to collect reasons provided by different stakeholders, lawyers, judges, local and international, historians and academics, in order to provide reasons for adopting or not adopting. And this where the findings come from.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Very helpful addition, almost from your introduction, shall we say. Fantastic. And people who want to contact you, your email's on your final slide, and hopefully people will want to do so. So if you turn off your share screen,
yep.
We can move on to Professor Fleming, who I think is, here we are, Michael.
Hi, Dan. Hi, everybody.
Great to have you with us. Absolutely. And perhaps you can give us the Polish dimension.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm going to share my screen, so work quite well. I think you can see it now. I'd just like to preface my remarks. I'm a historian, and for those who've been following the situation in Poland over the last couple of years now, will be well aware that there's something called the War on History, in which state-backed actors and state-backed non-government organizations are trying to pitch a particular narrative on Polish history, especially the history of the Second World War and the aftermath. And this history basically is a history and of course victims, Polish heroes. And I think we need to be aware of this context and the current debates going on in Poland when we discuss Poland's contribution to the United Nations War Crimes Commission. Poland's contribution to the War Crimes Commission is significant. It's significant in one of which, of course, is the battle to get news of atrocities, turn news of atrocities into knowledge about war crimes. And one of the first things that the Polish government exiles tried to do was to inform the Allies in London of the situation in Poland, in occupied Poland. And it did this through a number of publications, and Dominika, in her presentation in one of the panels this morning, touched upon this. And I think actually we are sharing some of the similar images of the covers of some of these books that were put out by the Polish government in 1940 and onwards. And it's important to recognize that this is part of a wider effort of diplomacy to get war crimes on the Allies' agenda. And this is in the context of Britain, of London, in which the British weren't particularly keen to discuss war crimes, and certainly not to have Britain responsible for the trials of war criminals at the end of the war. You know, we can think about the legacy of the Leipzig trials, the failure to try the Kaiser, but also in the response to news of atrocities as they were coming in. And we can certainly talk about the Foreign Office adopting a stance of strategic skepticism towards news of atrocities. And we can see this through 1940, 41, 42, especially in the summer of 1942, when we have very solid news of the extermination of Jews at camps such as Helmno, to a lesser extent news of extermination at Belzec and Sobibor. And of course, in August 1942, we have news of the Rhino telegram, and of course, some information about the deportation, the Great Deportation from Warsaw, news of which the Polish government suppressed to some extent during the summer. So what we have here is, on the one hand, different types of news being privileged by the Polish government in exile, and up until 1942, the late 1942, news of atrocities against Jews not being a particular focus for the government in exile. After that, that changes in December 1942, when we have the UN declaration, which officially and publicly declares that Germany is exterminating Jews. Prior to that, of course, we have the 10th December note from the Polish government, which is very important. So the context in which I'm going to talk about culture is a context in which the Polish government is publicizing news of atrocities with a view to converting that news of atrocities into knowledge about war crimes. And in these early publications from 1940 onwards, we see reference to international law, particularly the Hague Convention, throughout these publications, and basically the use of legal type language as well, which is quite important. So there is an ongoing project here to both inform and to persuade the international community that there is a legal solution to ultimately to secure justice for those who have committed offences. Now, within this wider project, the Polish government has been mentioned, and both by Dominika earlier today and by Julia, engagement with various organisations, the London International Assembly, the International Commission for Penal Reconstruction and Development, Conference of Allied Ministers of Education, the Central Institute of Art and Design, and so on. So there's all these organisations where we have groups of lawyers and interested professionals coming together discussing war crimes and the importance and indeed the necessity of ensuring that war criminals are prosecuted. And so this is the basis, the foundation, knowledge foundation for those conversations that later take place in the United Nations War Crimes Commission. So I think it's very important that we understand the pre-United Nations War Crimes Commission entanglement if we're going to understand the debates within the United Nations War Crimes Commission. It's all very important that we have this prehistory, if you like, this prelude to UNWCC, in the same way that we understand a prelude to Nuremberg. Now we get to the issue of crimes against culture. Culture or crimes against culture are recorded from the earliest days of the occupation of Poland, from beginning of October onwards, in terms of destruction of property, theft from libraries, and so on and so forth. And there are basically a number of officers which are established, and a number of individuals who are active in this particular area. Most significantly, we've got Karol Ostryka, who is very important, very close to Prime Minister Sikorski. And we also have a gentleman called Bolesław Lightgerber, who's at the Polish Embassy in London. And both these individuals compose rather substantial texts on cultural losses. We also see later on liaison with the Voucher Commission in terms of informing and gathering information about crimes against culture. And, you know, the war crime which is being discussed is derived from, as been noted in an earlier panel, from the Versailles list, which I'm sure we're all very familiar with. So I'd just like now to go through a few of the charge files which were submitted. And the idea here is just to highlight to you, and I'm sure most of you are all very familiar with the achievements of the United Nations War Crimes Commission in terms of, you know, highlighting and submitting indictments for gender-based violence, as Dan has highlighted in his own work, but also against culture. I mean, culture is quite important, and this was taken seriously. Now, what we'll see from these charge files is crimes against culture understand as Polish culture. But what do we mean by Polish culture? Poland, before the Second World War, was a multinational state. And so what we have here is, in general, not entirely, but in general, a tendency to privilege the dominant culture. And this is reflected a little bit, I think, in the book which was published in early 1945, Nazi Culture in Poland, which is basically a book which privileges Nazi culture. And at the very end, there's a couple of paragraphs discussing or mentioning Jewish culture. So we think about Eastern Poland and we think about other parts of Poland, which had a very rich Jewish culture, fantastic libraries, fantastic synagogues, so on and so forth. That really isn't part of the central discussion when we're talking about crimes against culture in Poland. It's there are references, but it's not really central. And we can make a number of arguments about this. We have to note, of course, that the Polish charge file submissions included a number of indictments referring to the death camps and concentration camps. And it's worth noting that there is a charge file submitted in June 1944, which mentions Auschwitz. And it's important for historical discussion because there is still a tendency for certain historians to think that Auschwitz was unknown until the Werber-Wetzler report, which only arrived in mid-June 1944. And obviously the file that I've just mentioned is from very early June 1944. Another thing that we need to mention is, well, how are these files, these indictments so detailed? Where did the information come from? And the information comes from the Polish underground state. And this is one of the reasons why the Polish government exile was advantaged, is that the charge files which it developed drew upon this very structured, well-organized underground state, which continuously sent information through the course of the war to the Polish government in exile. So the information which they had was somewhat more detailed, clearer, in many ways better than what was available to other governments in exile. So that's important to recognize. In terms of what we're talking about, culture is a very expansive term. You know, it can refer to museums, libraries, artifacts, but also people of culture, cultural elites. And I think within the Polish charge files, we can see the way in which the the composers of these charge files sought to integrate a broad notion of culture in their submissions. So we have this very interesting charge file which talks about the scholars from Krakow who were taken to camps in Germany. This was a very big issue for the in exile through the course of the war, in the way in which the cultural elite were being persecuted and ultimately some of them being murdered. And this obviously links to the notion of denationalization, which is discussed in the records of the United Nations War Crimes Commission. So I think what we've got here, and if we want to be precise, we can differentiate between different types of crimes against culture, but we also need to recognize that culture is this broad idea which can incorporate both people, objects, and processes as well. In this particular charge file, which is significantly limited by the Polish government exile, this is charge file 40, we do see some reference to the Great Library of the synagogue in Warsaw, which was obviously blown up by the Germans. So again, we see reference to international law. And so the earlier points which people have made in relation to legitimization is echoed in these charge files. There's always a reference to international law, Hague Convention, and so on and so forth. So what I'd like to say is that these charge files are definitely worth juxtaposing with the activities of other war crimes officers and the way in which different officers may have taken their task in slightly different direction and used different sources and resources to advance their particular agenda. If we move a little bit further on in the history of the War Crimes Office, obviously in July 1940, there's a shift from London to Warsaw, but there is a continuation of personnel to some extent. We do have people like, as Dominika pointed out in her paper, people like Manfred Lachs, we have people like Mieczysław Scherer, we have Tadeusz Cyprian, all going to Warsaw and taking with them a great deal of knowledge. And at the same time, we have people who've been working on the problem of crimes against culture also going to Warsaw. Estrecha went to Warsaw and he was one of the main drivers of the processes which allowed these Warsaw government to be submitted. At the same time, of course, we should recognize that the charge files which the Polish government exile submitted were available to the War Crimes Office operating under the Warsaw government. So there's a great deal of knowledge transfer between the Polish government exile's War Crimes Office and the War Crimes Office operating under the Warsaw government. And I think this is quite interesting when we think about the beginning of the Cold War and the way in which certain institutions like to have this tight line, a very sharp line between the good Polish government exile and the not so good government in Warsaw. We have a continuation of personnel, of people who are actually committed to ensuring that war criminals are prosecuted to the full extent that is possible. Again, we have a file which is quite significant. This is about the pillage of museums. And of course, this links into some of the concerns about the way in which German intellectuals and museum curators and scholars were complicit in the theft and the extraction of cultural wealth and cultural heritage from occupied countries, including Poland. And there are a number of charge files which actually name very well-known German art historians and so on as being responsible for the theft and indeed the loss of, priceless works of art and books and so on. Again, we see in this very.
I need to hurry you a little,
okay.
Michael, but you don't have to quite wrap up. But
okay, I'm just going to
pick up the pace slightly. It would be great.
I'm going to finish with this last one. This is the last substantial file I'm sharing with you, and again we see to looted property of Jews. And I think that's important. The situation of Jews and the theft of their property is mentioned in these charge files, and we can explore that in a lot more detail. So all what I'm talking about today, very briefly, is explored in a lot more depth in, as Dan says, in this forthcoming book, which is out in a couple of weeks' time. So hopefully that will be helpful for the ongoing debates on the United Nations War Crimes Commission. So thank you very much for your attention.
Oh, I didn't mean to cut you off, Michael, but I guess I spoke and you were, in fact, as a true professional, working to the correct time anyway. So forgive me for my rudeness. That was great. I must say, I find it very gratifying to see these lost documents up front and central in these presentations. I think they're important, as you say, for contemporary debates in history, and it's a mixed record. The London and Warsaw governments are more concerned about, let's say, mainstream Christian Polish culture, but there is concern, and there are quite a lot of prosecutions brought by the Commission, many prosecutions about the Holocaust in Poland. But bringing forward this cultural agenda, I think, is extremely important, because there is a Mark and others can help us, and from my own chambers can help us. There is an emerging debate at the moment about whether or not we need a new law or treaty to do with cultural crimes. And I think whether or not that's the case, I think your paper points to the fact that there is a body of customary international law and national practice around cultural crimes from the 1940s that people who are concerned about pursuing these issues today either are not aware of or aren't using. And whether or not, and this material that you've found, I think is probably most dramatic in the Polish case, but I would imagine that parallel research into prosecutions brought by other states would find that they also were pursuing cultural crimes. And indeed, the history of the UNWCC volume and the 15 volumes of cases, which I always look on as a compendium of examples, in a sense, they're tip of many icebergs, is what the Commission was trying to do in these publications. But there's one there of, I think, a Japanese corporal gets several months in jail for forcing a Sikh soldier to ingest tobacco and have his hair cut, which is another end of under the Hague Conventions. But what you have here, I think, is a comprehensive set of internationally supported indictments about, well, roughly speaking, one might say analogous to the dynamiting of statues in Afghanistan in the first Taliban regime, which is one of the issues which propels people to this day. So I think that what you've done will be of considerable interest and value to people, A, who are looking for precedent directly and practice to pursue these crimes today, and also reinforce them if for a new law, or possibly to say, we don't need to go through creating a new law, we just need to make use of what we already have. So forgive me if my response is almost as long as your presentation, but I must say I find it extremely interesting. Now, Camilla, you've been extremely, can you turn off your share screen? If you can, thank you. Camilla Louise Johnson-Wee, I'm using the whole name, I'm not sure that's correct, but
that's fine, thank you.
Yes, well, thank you very much for joining us, and very much look forward to hearing your insights. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I'll just share. Is that showing okay?
Yes.
Great, thank you very much. So yes, my name is Camilla Wee, and I'm a PhD fellow at ICOTS at the University of Copenhagen, working under a project called Just Sites. My own research is in the field of international criminal justice, where I'm looking at the case study, well, I'm looking at accountability in post-conflict East Timor. as a case study. So the title of my presentation is Big Fish and Small Fry in Localized Applications of International Criminal Justice, the UNWCC, Classes of Perpetrators and Accountability in Timor-Leste. I'd like to thank the organizers very much for having me and to you all for listening. Just by way of a little disclaimer, I'm fairly new to the study of the UNWCC, so bear with me if some of it is very much known to you already, but I hope perhaps my comparison with the case of Timor might be interesting. Because what I want to do with my talk is to juxtapose the localized justice of international crimes prosecuted after World War II with that of the more recent example, where, namely Timor-Leste, where there was also an attempt at localized justice some 50 years later. Of course, this quote goes to the question of why localized applications of international criminal law are important. So when we study, as the point has been made today several times before, when we study international criminal law, the genealogy is typically traced from Nuremberg and Tokyo, and then through to the revival of international criminal law in the 1990s. So most scholars will look at Nuremberg and not the War Crimes Commission. And similarly, most scholars will focus on the tribunals for the former Yugoslavia, Rwanda, and the ICC, and pay less attention to nationally based prosecutions of international crimes, such as the case in East Timor. But of course, the gravity attaching to these crimes is unchanged, and the capacity of the national systems far outweigh what we find at the international level. And of course, the some 2,000 trials at domestic level that the UNWCC supported underlines this point. And as I started looking at the Commission's work, what really piqued my interest was exactly that it represented the beginnings of international efforts to support localized justice. And so, as I said, this ties in with my research, which focuses on accountability for atrocities committed during the Indonesian occupation of East Timor, which lasted from 1975 to 1999, and where the United Nations, after the occupation, supported trials on serious crimes, including crimes against humanity and war crimes, and these trials were conducted in the country itself, so in East Timor. And what I noticed is the particular sort of structured way of thinking about the levels of perpetrators that surrounded the work of the United Nations War Crimes Commission seems to have been lost in the interim. And perhaps this happened while we were following the developments of the international tribunals quite closely. It's possible that we sort of took our eye off the domestic level. So I welcome the opportunity to refocus on this aspect. So in the short presentation, I refer to international criminal justice as the application of international criminal law as informed by the norms that underpin and legitimize it. And I place in this context the determination to combat impunity for atrocity crimes centrally. I'm also working with certain assumptions. The first being that international criminal law is still an immature area of law. There is an absence of an established institutional framework and settled practice having grown up around its administration. This in turn means that when atrocities are committed, there's always a certain level of uncertainty about how, if at all, international criminal law will be applied to ensure accountability. And a further consequence is that the aspirational norms of international criminal justice are rendered quite vulnerable to political influence. Against that background, we might pose the question of how to guard against this lack of certainty that especially comes from the role that politics plays in accountability. And in seeking to answer that question, I suggest that studying the structured approach surrounding the UNWCC in terms of perpetrators could provide at least part of the answer. So the first part of the structure that was developed by the Allied powers around the prosecution of perpetrators of war crimes is shown here in Article 1 of the London Agreement, enabling the establishment of the Nuremberg Tribunal, of course, to try the so-called major perpetrators. So there was a clear decision to separate out those most responsible to be tried within a specific setting. And arguably, the attention afforded this process speaks to the importance attached to holding, especially this high level of perpetrator accountable. The second level of perpetrator was the category which the work of the UN War Crimes Commission primarily concerned. So, of course, it coordinated the local prosecution by allied nations of acts as perpetrators of war crimes of a reasonable importance. The basis for these prosecutions were laid 2 years earlier, 2 years prior to the London Agreement, when the UK, US, and Soviet Union stated in the Moscow Declaration that alleged perpetrators of war crimes of the Nazi regime were to be returned to the countries of their alleged crimes to stand trial in the domestic justice system. It's clear that a consideration of the differentiation of classes of perpetrators took place already in 1943, as the Moscow Declaration referred to major criminals of the Nazi Party and specified that the declaration was without prejudice to these cases. But coming to the third part of this structure, which is represented by this section from a 1945 UNWCC memorandum, and shows that, that the differentiation was not only between the so-called major war criminals who were tried at Nuremberg and the minor or mid-level perpetrators who were to be tried in the domestic jurisdiction where the alleged crimes had been perpetrated. In addition, there was this third category or class of perpetrators, namely those accused of crimes against their own countrymen. And as the paragraph shows, this was a class of perpetrator with which the Commission did not concern itself. Their accountability was left for the national jurisdictions alone. So what's interesting is that the origins of international criminal law here illustrate very specific considerations about the appropriateness of trying different levels of perpetrators in different settings, and that the Allied nations concerned themselves with those considered most responsible as a priority, and also those alleged to have committed war crimes of a reasonable importance in other countries. Both of these categories were deemed relevant for different kinds of internationally supported accountability measures. The third category, by contrast, so those alleged to have committed crimes against persons of their own nationalities in their home countries, were explicitly excluded from the remit of the Commission's work. So bearing this structure in mind, I'd like to turn now to look at internationally supported accountability for atrocity crimes in Timor-Leste. So of 4 accountability processes, 2 were truth and reconciliation initiatives and 2 formal justice processes. But of these, it was only really the internationally supported special panels which are seen as a credible attempt at holding perpetrators accountable. So I'm going to focus on these. The panels were established during the UN administration of East Timor before Timor gained its independence as Timor-Leste in 2002. But the panels were placed within the Timorese National Court structure, and notably those indicted were both Indonesian military as well as Timorese pro-Indonesian militia members. At this point, I want to acknowledge that, of course, the UNWCC and the special panels, despite both representing international accountability efforts, are qualitatively different. So the Commission had a broadly speaking coordinative mandate, whereas in Timor-Leste, the UN supported investigations and trials directly. Furthermore, the institutional context differed greatly, whereas while the Commission was directed by a group of 17 allied nations, the special panels were supported by the established United Nations. And finally, also in terms of the geopolitical situation, of course, the Commission was created by a collective of powerful nations and winners of the Second World War with established domestic justice systems, while the United Nations in Timor-Leste sought to support domestic level accountability in a young nation with a barely existing formal justice system, and which was moreover in a very politically weak situation vis-a-vis Indonesia. Yet I do make the comparison, one, because the legitimacy of international criminal justice as an area is not built solely on the foundation of Nuremberg. And if we're looking at the domestic level, then the foundation is quite clearly also the United Nations War Crimes Commission. And my second reason is that regardless of the different circumstances, I would argue that the Commission holds a relevant lesson, namely that a keener awareness within the UN of the need to differentiate might have led to a different approach in Timor-Leste. As it was, the Timorese case, in the Timorese case, the prosecution of the higher level perpetrator never really got off the ground. So the first problem in this respect was non-cooperation. Indictees were simply not extradited from Indonesia. This meant that Indonesian commanders and military, along with high-level Timorese militia, actually escaped justice simply by crossing the border into Indonesia. The second problem was that as the UN reduced its engagement, the inability for Timor politically to insist on justice became quite apparent. So the quote here is from is connected to the case of Martinez Bearer. So in 2009, a Timorese pro-Indonesian militia commander wanted for crimes against humanity in connection with especially in connection with a massacre which took place in a district church, crossed the border back into Timor and was recognized and apprehended by authorities. What then happened was that the leaders of the country and justice institutions together worked to have him released into the custody of the Indonesian embassy. And of course, he was never tried. And the quote here is from the vote of no confidence, which the then Prime Minister Xanana Gusmao of Timor-Leste faced for his role in leading the efforts to have this man basically escape justice. And what Xanana emphasized in this in his defense was the absolute necessity of and national interest in maintaining good relations with Indonesia. So he references border incursions, and he references the need to have good trade relations. And in this case, he actually survived the vote of no confidence. So some perpetrators were out of the panel's reach, but of course, the panels did prosecute those indictees who remained in Timor-Leste. So by default, these tended to be the low to mid-level Timorese militia members. So from one perspective, the special panels did work to secure at least a measure of accountability. However, this quote shows the fundamental problem of the panel's inability to pursue those seen as most responsible, and by default only reaching the small fish. And what is striking, however, when compared to the structured differentiation of the UNWCC process, is that the perpetrators generally, that the panels generally reached were exactly those who had committed war crimes against their own countrymen within Timor-Leste, that is to say, the category which the UNWCC placed outside of its remit. So the point is naturally not that there ought to be impunity for this category of perpetrator, but simply that by contrast to the clear prioritization of the international accountability efforts after the Second World War, in the early 2000s, what the international effort in effect supported in the case of Timor was the country's prosecution of its own. And so why is this a problem for international criminal law? Well, it's essentially this idea noted by Professor McGray that apart from combating impunity for these crimes in a broader sense, the application of international criminal justice also signals that some individuals are particularly to blame. And this point, of course, leaves the uncomfortable question of what we should then conclude from the process of the special panels in Timor. So finally, I'll return to my initial suggestion of the importance of the lessons that the United Nations War Crimes Commission process holds, because from this specific bird's eye view, when Indonesia finally left Timor-Leste, what ended up happening was that the UN's support for achieving justice laid responsibility for the atrocities committed at the doorstep of the Timorese themselves. So the merits of the individual cases tried by the panels notwithstanding, I suggest that this is surely an issue of legitimacy, a critical issue of legitimacy for international criminal justice. And so if the future of international law is indeed domestic, the lessons of the United Nations War Crimes Commissions in terms of this structured approach to holding perpetrators accountable might just be a key part of getting that future right. So thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we've had three remarkably powerful and penetrating presentations, and I only wish one could transmit them directly into international public policy, but I guess Mark will do that for us. Both Marla and Camilla's are looking, both have very powerful examples from desperately suffering parts of the world as to how people there potentially can benefit from the lessons of this work done far, far away, as they say, in a galaxy far, far away. And Michael's, well, one might say, without being facetious, might save current devotees of developing new law an awful lot of time and trouble by simply drawing upon national precedent and practice on cultural crimes and applying them today, not least through the EU, which is contains many of the prominent members of the UNWCC. That would be my summary of one of those. Again, I say I think another stellar panel, and it's really tremendous to see it. And Camilla, I don't think you have any need to have any qualms. I think you have grasped the essence and applied the detail as any of us, well, veterans, if I can call it that, might have done. And as I say, I think this differentiation, or if I make a minor quibble, let's say the Allies made a differentiation between those top-level crimes and those that would be dealt with by the UNWCC. But that's a semantic quibble, really. I'd like now to open the floor. Michael, you can turn your video on, and the rest of the cast of characters here who are muted and have their videos off, if you are able to, if the technology permits, please show us your faces and let us hear your voices. Throw up your hand if you want to, or just start shouting. If it gets too noisy, then I'll maybe insist upon hands, but let's just get going. And do feel free to use the chat. Mark, dive in.
Thanks, Dan. I don't want to take away from other participants, so I'm eager to hear what other some of the other questions. I really found those three presentations just superb, really fascinating, and throws up a lot of great questions. So I don't have time to answer them all. I would say Michael's point on the cultural crimes is so relevant today with as he says, with the international community and even in the International Criminal Court wrestling with this. And Dan, you alluded to it. So great things there. I wanted to ask Camilla and Maria to answer this question because you both brought this issue up. Camilla talking about international lawyers emphasizing kind of domestic prosecutions, and I agree. I think that's consistent with the ICC's sense of complementarity, and I think there's a bias in that direction. And Maria, you on Lebanon, fascinating about suggesting there needs to be another accountability mechanism. So I wanted to ask you whether or not you feel, particularly with the Lebanon, the special tribunal for Lebanon and the perception that that didn't quite go the way it should have gone, huge expense and really no result in it, to be honest. I think many people would suggest that. Do you think there's an appetite in the international community to create yet another accountability mechanism for what you consider to be an atrocity crime, which I'm not going to argue with that? Or is just this something that has to play itself out? And maybe there's a universal jurisdiction component that was mentioned earlier this morning on it. And Camilla, do you see, because of this issue of domestic prosecutions, do you see that there is room in there to do that vis-a-vis Lebanon, or is there just no gap here for that?
Camila, would you like to start, or?
No, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you so much, Mark, for this. Actually, coming from an experience, I feel now it's the time, like as a Lebanese person, also like before engaging in the STL as like a national junior professional, I think that there is a need, and this need for a new legal paradigm pushes us like to have this like appetite by international scholars to have this, only because day to day we are seeking the massive violations of human rights are being like internationally practiced and widely, and this has been kind of stressing the point of how the ICC and other international tribunals are able to bring this comprehensive justice. And this like kind of, I would say the critiques of the ICC pushes us to find a new way, and instead of looking for an amendment of the Rome Statute, which would not solve any problems, it's time to open up and see how we can have the support to the ICC, also to the population, when like to the citizens themselves, when the states are not willing to prosecute themselves. So yeah, I think that, well, I'm kind of like, I'm writing this paper like from a pragmatic approach, but also with strong hope that it's now the time to start thinking about this legal paradigm and how we can see it in practice.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks very much for the question. I don't feel equipped to really speak to particularly the Lebanon case that Marla raised, but I would say sort of generally that and I don't know if there's room or there's momentum right now to create another or expand the framework at this point. But what I was trying to get at more was just to say that in this particular case of East Timor, it's clear that we can say, we, the international community can say, well, a measure of accountability was achieved through the panels. So, you know, that's a positive thing that you can say in terms of combating impunity. But if you look at it through the more structured lens of the approach taken after the Second World War, then it becomes more difficult to hide that actually those who were prioritized in terms of accountability after the Second World War were actually those who, you know, did not face justice in this case. So I think I don't know if there's a momentum to create anything new, but I think at least sort of highlighting that that gap in the accountability it would be a step in that direction. Is that the kind of international criminal justice that that states and communities support? Because right now, at least in this case, that was what it was achieved. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Any more for any more, please? We've got a tremendous group here, and I know that for some people this is a very fast and sharp learning curve. So don't worry about appearing ignorant with your questions and comments. We all have to start. Someone still remember when I first stumbled on this body and thought, what on earth is this? Is it a typo?
I have a question, if I may.
Yes, please.
Yes, I had to switch to my mobile phone. Thank you for all presentation. I had a question to Professor Fleming, asking about his experience and findings while researching on the persecution of culture in the UNWCC charges, also the resources of the Sikorski Museum or Polish Institute and Sikorski Museum in London. To what extent can these documents be complementary to the charge files in the archive of the UNWCC? Yes, that was my question.
Okay, unfortunately, you dropped out a little bit. I think there was something wrong with my bandwidth, but I got something about the Sikorski Museum and how those documents might complement the charge files that we've got. The Sikorski Museums are interesting. I mean, they actually should have all the material, but it was taken to Warsaw probably in 45, so they don't have what you might expect they should have, you know, in terms of documentation from Cyprian, from Lax during the early part, but there is some material, and this material in terms of cabinet meetings, all this kind of stuff is fairly interesting and can be used to some extent. There's some material in the MSV files, the Ministry of the Interior files, which can be helpful. However, in my view, the most useful sources are the ones from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which are now available online. There's a lot of stuff in the Mikołajczyk files. If you go up to the Hoover Institute has a lot of nice documentation. The Potalutsky files are quite helpful in this respect. But you know, most of the most useful material is actually in the IPN in Warsaw, as you are well aware. They got the material, and it's been there for a long time and hasn't been really exploited as much as it should. The problem with the IPN, of course, is it's not as easy to use as other archives, and certainly not as easy as the National Archives in London. And of course, then there's another things going on with the IPN at the moment, which you know we don't necessarily need to go into this for, but there are some other issues with the IPN at the moment. I didn't catch the first part of your question. I'm sorry, Dominika.
Well, no, the question was in general about this, yes, complementarity of archives, because I can imagine we have traced or tried to trace the same collections. Mm-hmm. And what I think is very interesting in working with UNWCC, this legacy in each regional context or concrete case, that it can be supplemented, complemented by holdings from archives from different countries, and mm-hmm. Not all of them are so obvious. Mm-hmm. Therefore, this question for Sikorski, which is very specific and particular collection, sometimes by accident you just find this rare document. And yes, IPN is interesting story, but on the other hand, in recent years, many of the holdings of the main commission mm-hmm. of investigation of war crimes were digitalized. So when you order them, really large number of files are accessible as PDF files. Mm-hmm. So this question was more general about when researching these crimes against culture in Polish or other context? What other archival holdings could we use?
Well, I think if I could say, I think that the charge files and records and the committee minutes themselves are an untapped resource to complement this story. But it also, Dominica and Michael, that you have a continuing useful bilateral conversation to have. Chidi, can I bring you in?
Yes, thank you, Dan. I think I want to make a comment on the earlier question asked by Mark on the appetite for another mechanism for international criminal trials. I understand the responses of the panelists. I also think that the appetite for another mechanism is not really strong among states, considering that universal jurisdiction has not really made it. You will see what happened to Belgium, and they changed the law. Then again, establishing another international mechanism may not have the support of states such as Russia, China, considering what happened in Libya and Syria. It's just far-fetched to assume that states most likely will go on to that. Then again, you ask, is International Criminal Court up to the task? And the answer is neither here nor there. States will just have to find a way of getting around it. It may be universal jurisdiction. It may be alternative means, judicial processes such as the Gacaca in Rwanda. But then again, those are within states. But the UN models that has been, such as the Rwanda model that has now been translated to the I've forgotten the name now, the model that is the keepsake, IMT, not IMT, following Rwanda. It may be the means to go in which state international system may go about going on with these trials. But Cambodia, Lebanon, they have not really shown any example that or any hint of a successful pathway outside the International Criminal Court. Neither has the International Criminal Court shown the pedigree to hold up to it. Yet again, the International Criminal Court has a better chance of succeeding in the long run than the standalone tribunals. Thank you.
Mark, you want to respond?
I think I don't like to, I won't bias the discussion, but I think Chidi is absolutely spot on. I think evidence shows that, and it's a compelling challenge for the international community as to do we continue to see the International Criminal Court as the world criminal court, or are there opportunities to create new mechanisms, and Camilla's point about domestic focus as well. But it comes back to Chidi's point, is there appetite for that? And I think the experience at Lebanon, Cambodia, as he's used two examples, there are others, would suggest that that's a very tough hill to climb. Not impossible, but boy, I think the stars would have to be aligned for the international community to say, okay, let's go this route, create yet another mechanism to make things happen. But again, I could be very wrong on this, but that's my instinct. So I think Chidi is on that.
So, Chidi, do you want to just say a word about the little bit of work we did together on the UN Declaration of 1942, when I raised the question, which came to me in Geneva, was this an international treaty or not? Just maybe ask Mark and others what the implications are, as this appears to be a treaty, because it's just a footnote otherwise.
Well, I think going with the core legal, if we have to go the way the International Criminal Court has seen treaty to be, and the laws, strictly positive law, you would say it's a treaty, maybe not a standalone treaty, but as part of the United Nations instruments. That would be my short answer to it. Definition of a treaty, within that definition of a treaty, it will fall in within the definition of a treaty, then it can be
Because what we discovered,
otherwise.
a number of states lodged it as a treaty.
Yes, that's what I found.
Which I just find odd that it's fallen off the scope. Anyway, this is perhaps too esoteric even for this discussion. Let's see if we can bring other people in, and if not, we can ask our panelists to give a quick summary round. I think a lot of people are on receive, which is just fine. And I can't use, Marla, well, you could then say something and use it as a part of your winding up remarks. Brilliant, thank you.
So actually I have a comment on what Chidis has mentioned, and thank you so much for this comment. And I think that I do agree, especially bringing the Cambodia example additional to the STL. And like, I think now we are at the stage of setting the agenda, which is how to create this appetite, because we with all the challenges and the critiques of the ICC, and was like, all like, as you mentioned, would China, would Russia be willing to do this? And I think now we are in this kind of how we can bring the domestic focus within the aim of the international, like in today's international justice. And also like our role right now is setting the agenda in the way that to create the will in the international community, because we just see a hopeful and pragmatic approach might be going on. I just want to also ask a question for, if you have time to plan it. I'm interested, it's my first time hearing about the cultural crimes, especially looking back at the Poland history. I'm just wondering, from a comparative perspective, how we can see, just like to better understand the cultural crimes, how is it, like, comparatively speaking, how can we see this being impacted in today, like comparing to what happened in the past, but how we can see the impacts or the influence of today in terms of cultural crimes? I know it might be like kind of not inappropriate to ask, like in terms of like inadequate, but I just want to learn more about the concept of cultural crimes and how it's been moved from the past till today.
I mean, there are two ways this could move forward. One, of course, is that lawyers can look back on what was achieved by the United Nations War Crimes Commission and the debates within that forum, and take inspiration from that to say, well, this has been done in the past. We have this example. Let's get moving on the cultural crimes which are happening today and are ongoing. So that's the positive aspect of it. On the other hand, we have to be aware that we are in this populist moment in history. And although we look back on the United Nations war crimes as scholars and as lawyers and seek inspiration for a better future through those achievements, we also need to be aware that this history can be misrepresented and it can be possibly used for nefarious purposes. So we need to be alert as both historians, as lawyers, and as citizens to the way in which we narrate and understand this particular past, and be sensitive to those actors who are very active at the moment in certain countries who wish to subvert this particular history in a particular direction, a particular nationalist direction. I think there are enough people, enough good lawyers, good historians to make sure that doesn't happen, but we need to be alert to that particular possibility. And that would be my concluding remarks as well, Dan. So thank you.
Well, that's
Dan,
great.
Dan, could I do one little point? And because I would feel really guilty if I left this, because I felt like perhaps I was a bit too harsh, Marla, to your remarks on Lebanon, and I don't want you to feel that way. You're the youth, and you look at justice, and that's so important. And so I'll support you 100% for that. I was just suggesting that there are challenges, there are greater challenges right now than there were in the past, but I don't want you to ever think that I feel anything different from going after and ensuring justice is done. So.
No, not at all. Thank you so much. I think that even in my presentation, I did include this sort of like the challenges are now.
Hold on, we have 90 seconds, Camilla.
Well, I don't have a lot to add, but perhaps just one thought that Marla's presentation made me think of, and also Mark Ellis's point, which was it's not that we don't have any sort of cooperation, international cooperation in terms of investigations. It made me think a lot of the work that's going on in commissions of inquiry and fact-finding missions mandated through the Human Rights Council. And it seems to me that maybe that's something to build on, you know, not necessarily establishing something new, but if there is a need to sort of build a more consistent framework, maybe there's something there in combination with what we can learn from the past.
That's a very interesting thought, which we had not had. Thank you so much for that. Which will take us back to Geneva. Anybody else want to take the last 30 seconds? Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think we're done. Thank you for another really fascinating panel.